Mother gave everything to my brother. It wasn't a gradual thing, not a slow bleed of favoritism that you could spot from a distance and brace yourself against. It was a flood, a deluge, a lifelong downpour of resources, attention, affection, and opportunity that fell on him and him alone. I stood on the sidelines, the designated observer, the one who watched and learned to expect nothing. The one who was praised for being so easy, for never asking for anything, for being so independent. I was the daughter who didn't need because my brother, my older brother Julian, needed everything. The house we grew up in was a monument to his needs. It wasn't a big house, but it was our entire world. There were 3 bedrooms, but only 2 were ever really used. Mine was a repository for hand-me-down furniture, a place for my clothes and my books, a space I inhabited but that never felt like mine. Julian's room was a kingdom. It was painted the color he chose, had the latest gaming console, the oversized desk for his art supplies, the queen-sized bed that took up most of the floor space. My mother would spend hours in there, helping him organize his comic books, framing his drawings, adjusting his blinds so the light was perfect. When I was sick, she'd leave a glass of water by my door. When he was sick, she'd sleep in a chair next to his bed, her hand on his forehead. I told myself I didn't mind. It was easier that way. The path of least resistance was the one I walked, and I learned to find my own quiet satisfactions. I excelled at school because it was a place where I could be judged on my own merit. I made friends who were my chosen family. I read voraciously, escaping into worlds where the distribution of love was fair, where the protagonist was seen. I took up running, pounding the pavement until my lungs burned, the rhythmic impact of my feet on the ground, a meditation that helped me release the nameless, shapeless resentment that I refused to acknowledge. The inequality was so deeply woven into the fabric of our lives that it was almost invisible, like the background radiation of the universe. It was there in the big things, the ones that were hard to ignore, but also in the tiny, granular details that I catalogued like a quiet archivist of injustice. When we were both in high school, Julian crashed the car. It was his fault, a moment of inattention on a rainy night that ended with a crumpled fender and a terrifying scrape on a telephone pole. My mother didn't yell. She didn't even sigh. She just held him while he cried, stroking his hair, telling him it was okay, that it was just a car, that they'd sort it out. That weekend she bought him a newer, safer car. The insurance went up, but the money was found. A year later, I was at the same age, driving the old family sedan, and I backed into a post in the grocery store parking lot. I was sobbing when I got home, a mix of guilt and terror. My mother's face hardened. "You need to be more careful, Ilara," she said, her voice cold. "We can't afford to fix things like this." I paid for the repairs myself out of my savings from a part-time job at the library. The pattern held steady through college. My mother and father, who was more of a ghost in our house than a presence, a quiet man who had long ago abdicated any domestic authority in favor of a silent life in his workshop, co-signed a loan for Julian's tuition to an expensive art school in New York. He wanted to be a creative, he said. He was finding himself. The money for my college education came from a modest state scholarship, my own savings from years of working, and a part-time job I held down all 4 years. When I called home exhausted to tell my mother I'd been accepted into a competitive graduate program for history, she said, "That's wonderful, honey, you always were the smart one." The next week I got a call from my father, his voice unusually strained. "Your mother's worried about your brother," he said. "He's having a hard time in the city, he needs a new laptop and his rent is behind." I didn't ask, I knew what the answer was. The money they had put aside for my first semester's tuition, the money they'd promised, had been redirected. "Worry," my father said quickly, as if he could outrun the implication. "We'll figure something out. You can just take a job for a year, save up, it won't set you back that much." I didn't tell him that I was already on a financial precipice. I didn't tell him that this was the final crushing blow. I just said, "Okay, Dad," and hung up and let the tears come in the quiet of my tiny dorm room while my roommate was out. I felt it then, a sharp, clean break, not of anger but of acceptance. I was on my own, and I was fine with that. I was more than fine. I was free. I took the year off, working 2 jobs, and I never asked my parents for another dime. When I started my graduate program, I was self-sufficient. I worked as a teaching assistant, I tutored, I wrote grant applications. I built a life that was sturdy and whole and completely independent of the ecosystem of my childhood. Julian, in the meantime, drifted. He'd come home for holidays with grand tailies of gallery shows and potential patrons, but he was always just on the verge, just about to be discovered. There was always a new crisis, a stolen portfolio, a sudden illness, a mentor who had betrayed him. My mother's worry was a constant, low hum. She'd wire him money, she'd pay his credit card bills, she'd spend hours on the phone with him, offering a soft, absorbing cushion of support. I started to receive the same compliments from well-meaning relatives. Your mother tells me you're doing so well, Ilara. So independent, your brother needs a little more help, you know, he's the artist. He's sensitive. The subtext was thick enough to choke on. I was the practical one, I didn't have talent, I had grit. Grit was fine, grit was necessary. Grit was what I had, the truth, when it finally came, arrived not as a thunderclap but as a slow leak, a trickle of information that started with a single innocuous email. I was 28, working as a research archivist at a university, happy in my quiet, ordered life. I had a small apartment, a cat, and a burgeoning collection of rare history books. I was happy. I'd made a life that was a fortress against the chaos of my family. My father had a heart attack, a bad one. I drove the 6 hours back to my hometown, my mind a blank slate of dread. My mother met me at the hospital, her face pale and drawn. She had aged a decade in the few years since I'd seen her last. The first thing she said before even telling me about my father's condition was, "I can't get a hold of Julian. I've left him a dozen messages. He's probably in a studio with no signal." I didn't point out that there was always signal in New York. I just nodded and went to see my father. He looked small and frail in the hospital bed, a man who had always been a shadow. Now nearly translucent. He was alive, stable, but he was fadding. I stayed for a week. My mother spent most of her time on her phone trying to reach Julian while I sat with my father holding his hand, reading the news aloud to him from his tablet. When Julian finally arrived, breezing in on the 5th day in a cloud of expensive cologne and a flurry of apologies, my mother collapsed into his arms, sobbing with relief. He had just been in a zone, he said, working on a new series. He'd simply forgotten to charge his phone. My mother just nodded, her relief so potent it erased any hint of reproach. During my stay, I was tasked with going to the house to retrieve some of my father's files. "They're in the back of the closet," my mother had said, waving a hand vaguely. "In the office." My parents' home office was a small, cluttered room that my mother had converted from a guest bedroom. It was always a mess, a chaotic mix of bills, receipts, and my mother's endless knitting projects. I started sorting through the boxes in the closet looking for the files. They were in a filing cabinet that was pushed into a corner, half hidden behind a stack of dusty photo albums. I pulled open the top drawer. It was filled with tax returns. I wasn't looking for them, but my eye caught a familiar name, Julian A. Grayson. The file was thick, much thicker than the others. I was about to close the drawer and move on to mind my own business as I had been so expertly trained to do, but something stopped me. A sense of foreboding, a whisper of a feeling that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. I pulled the file out. It wasn't just one tax return, it was years of them, and they weren't for Julian's business. They were his personal returns. As I flipped through them, my eyes scanning the columns of numbers, the numbers didn't add up. At first I thought I was reading them wrong. The income reported was substantial. In the tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, for a man who was perpetually just about to be discovered, who couldn't make his rent and needed his mother to cover his expenses. The numbers were absurd. My hands started to shake. I didn't stop there. I opened the second drawer. It was filled with bank statements. Not my parents' accounts, but Julian's. His checking account, his savings, his investment portfolio. I saw the deposits, the credits, the astronomical balances. I saw withdrawals for a high-end Manhattan apartment. I saw money going into a brokerage account. I saw the life of a man who was not only comfortable but wealthy. I sank onto the dusty floor of the office, surrounded by my parents' past, the truth blooming inside me like a dark, ugly flower. The file was a history of a lie. The narrative of the struggling artist was a fiction. He hadn't just been taking my parents' money, he had been actively, deliberately creating a false identity as a needy, helpless victim to extort it. He'd been milking them for years while secretly sitting on a fortune. My mother must have known. How could she not? She was the one who kept the books, who managed the accounts, who paid his bills. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. She knew. She knew exactly how much money he had, and she knew that he was lying to her, yet she continued to give him everything. She helped him perpetuate the lie. I closed the file and put it back in the drawer. I sat there for a long time, my mind a storm of questions. Why would she do this? What was the point? Was she so desperate to have him need her that she would enable this elaborate deception? Was it just a game to her? A sick, twisted game where she pretended to be the savior while he played the victim, and I was the only one who had been left in the dark. My father's files were in the bottom drawer. I found them numb and took them to the hospital. I didn't say anything to my mother. I couldn't. The words were lodged in my throat, a toxic knot of anger and hurt. I just handed her the files and went to sit with my father. The next week was a blur of hospital visits, awkward family dinners, and a persistent, gnawing feeling of unreality. I was waiting. I was waiting for someone to confess, for the truth to be acknowledged, but everyone acted as if nothing had happened. My mother was solicitous of my father's health. Julian was the doting son, promising to stick around for a while. I was the dutiful daughter, the one who had made the long drive to help. The day before I was set to leave, I couldn't take it anymore. My father was sleeping. My mother was in the hospital cafeteria getting a cup of coffee. Julian was in the waiting room scrolling through his phone. I walked up to him, my heart hammering against my ribs. "You need to stop taking their money," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the sterile hospital air like a knife. He looked up, his expression one of practiced confusion. "What are you talking about?" "The taxes, Julian, the bank statements." The words felt like shards of glass in my mouth. "I saw everything in your file in the office, the accounts you have, you're loaded." His face, for a fraction of a second, went white. Then a mask of perfect sympathy slid into place. "Oh, Ilara," he said, sighing, "you've been looking at the wrong things. Those are all fake. It's part of my art project. I've been creating an elaborate financial persona. It's a performance piece about the illusion of wealth." He laughed, a hollow, practiced sound. "God, you really don't get it, do you? You're so literal." I just stared at him. The audacity of the lie was breathtaking. He was so good at it. He'd been lying for years and he'd perfected the art. I didn't have the energy to fight him. I turned and walked away, my hands shaking. I knew what I had to do. I found my mother in the cafeteria. She was sitting alone, staring into her coffee cup. I slid into the seat across from her. "I saw Julian's files," I said. "All of them." She looked up, her eyes were flat, impassive. She knew exactly what I was talking about. There was no shock. There was no confusion. It was the look of a woman who had been caught and who had known for a long time that she would be. "Your brother is an artist," she said, her voice tired. "He needs to be free from the burden of money. It crushes creativity. I don't want him to worry about such things. I want him to be happy." "Has money," I said, my voice rising. "He has millions. He's sitting on a fortune and he's been bleeding you dry. He made you think he was poor so you would give him more." Why would you allow that? Why didn't you tell me?" My mother's face crumpled. For a moment, the mask of the stoic, self-sacrificing mother cracked and I saw something raw and desperate underneath. "Because I need him to need me, Ilara," she cried, her voice cracking. "He's the only one who ever made me feel needed. You were so self-sufficient, so strong. You never needed me. He needed me. I could help him. I could fix things for him. He let me be a mother. You didn't need a mother, you just needed a manager." The words landed in my chest like a physical blow. I couldn't breathe. She had just admitted it. The whole thing was a performance, a grand, elaborate play, and she was the lead actress. The loving, devoted mother, sacrificing everything for her troubled son. And I, with my independence and my competence, was the antagonist. I was the one who ruined the story. "You chose him," I whispered. "You chose the lie over the truth. You chose his need over my reality. You didn't just give him everything, you gave him my story too." I stood up. The cafeteria was closing in on me, the fluorescent lights too bright, the silence too loud. I didn't wait for a reply. I just walked away. I walked out of the hospital, out of the town, and I drove back to my quiet, ordered life. I drove away from the lie that had been my childhood and the woman who had built it. The aftermath was a slow, painful unspooling. I didn't speak to my mother or Julian for over a year. My father, when he was well enough, came to visit me once. He looked tired and old. He sat in my apartment, drank a cup of tea and said, "Your mother has her reasons, Ilara. I know it's hard to understand. She's not a bad person. She's just broken." I didn't say anything. What could I say? She had shattered my entire sense of self. All my life I had told myself I was the strong one, the independent one. I had worn my self-sufficiency like a badge of honor. But my mother's words had revealed the ugly truth. My independence wasn't a virtue I had earned. It was a role I had been forced into. I was the daughter she didn't have to worry about, so she could pour all her emotional energy into the son who would never leave her. I was a prop in her story. A supporting character in a drama where my brother was the star and my mother was the devoted director. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening. It was my aunt, my mother's sister. Her voice was strained. "Ilara, honey, you need to come home. It's your mother. She's in the hospital." My heart seized. "What happened?" "A stroke. A small one, they think, but she's scared, Ilara. She's asking for you, and your brother. Well, he's here, but he can't handle it. He's having some kind of breakdown." I drove back. I didn't think. I just went. When I walked into the hospital room, my mother was lying in the bed, looking smaller and frailer than ever. Julian was packing by the window, his face twisted in agitation. "Mom, I can't stay here," he was saying. "This place is so stifling. I need to be in New York. I have a show coming up. They need me. Can't you just get a nurse?" My mother's eyes were closed, her face pale. I walked in and Julian stopped packing. He looked at me with a mixture of guilt and contempt. "Ilara, good, you can handle this. I can't. I have responsibilities." "Out," I said. My voice was flat. "Get out, Julian," he bristled. "Excuse me, this is my mother. I have a right to be here." "You don't have a right to anything. You've taken everything." Now get out before I tell the hospital security what you've been doing." He looked at me, and for a moment I saw a flash of something that might have been fear. He knew I had the proof. He walked out without another word. I sat down next to my mother's bed. I took her hand. It was dry and cold. "Ilara," she opened her eyes. "You came." "I'm here, Mom." She looked at me, her gaze blurry and unfocused. "I was so afraid he would leave," she said, her voice a faint whisper. "He's all I have. He's my life's work." "What about me?" I asked, the question I had been holding in my heart for my entire life. "What was I?" She closed her eyes, a tear leaking from the corner. "You didn't need me to be your life's work," she said. "You had your own. I was so proud of you. I was terrified of you." I held her hand as the sun went down, and I listened to the steady beep of the machines. I didn't feel anger anymore. I just felt a deep, bone-weary sadness. She had loved me in her own way. She had been proud of me, but she had been a prisoner of her own fears. She needed to be needed, and Julian had given her that. He had given her a purpose, a role, an identity. I had been the threat, the reminder that she could be irrelevant. Over the next few weeks as she recovered, we talked. It wasn't easy, it was painful. She never fully apologized, she never fully admitted fault. But she did listen. She told me about her own childhood, about being the invisible middle child, about how she had vowed to never let her children feel unseen. She had overcorrected. She had chosen the child who screamed the loudest, the one who needed the most, and in doing so she had made her other child completely invisible. Julian, after I exposed his lies to the rest of the family, cut ties. He wasn't angry at them for finding out, he was angry at me for exposing him. He moved to Europe, I heard, and changed his name. My father and I have a strange, quiet relationship. We don't talk about it, we just are. We share a quiet existence, a mutual understanding that we were both spectators in a drama that wasn't about us. My mother is older now. She lives in a quiet assisted living facility. She has moments of clarity and moments of confusion. I visit her on the 1st of every month. I sit with her, I brush her hair, and I let her talk about Julian. She still asks about him. She still wonders if he's okay. I don't tell her that he's fine, that he's living the life she paid for. I just nod and let her memory of him be whatever it needs to be. The truth that came out didn't just expose my brother. It exposed everything. It wasn't the truth about the money that changed me, it was the truth about my mother. The money was just the vehicle. The love, or lack thereof, was the cargo. She didn't love H.